We do want to turn here now to another very important story, this one that you've probably seen a little bit about, and that is the island nation of Sri Lanka, where mass protests have been happening and quite a bit has been going on there in regards to that. So we want to and are honored to be joined here on the show by Niyanthini Kadirgamar, who is a PhD student at University of Amherst and also a member of the Feminist Collective for Economic Justice in Sri Lanka. Niyanthini, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you. I think a lot of people have probably seen kind of the big headlines. I think many millions of people saw the protest images of people going in and taking over the presidential palace. So people know a little something about, I think, the protest movement and the crisis in Sri Lanka. But well, there's a lot we could say about this. Let me just start here with sort of the big news of the past couple days that people may be wondering about, and that's this new president and whether or not this represents some form of change or whether or not the protest won or what that might represent.
I think July 9th was an incredible moment for democracy in Sri Lanka. We saw waves and waves of people crowding into the Golface Green in Colombo, the capital city. And the people came in spite of a curfew the previous night and huge fuel shortages. They found ways to just get there. And I think it was the show of strength of ordinary people just showing up and showing that they no longer want the incumbent president to continue in his post that eventually made Gotabaya Rajapaksa flee the country and also to resign the post. And I think that protest was definitely something that we've not seen in a long time in Sri Lanka. The events of the following week and what has been going on this week has in some ways dampened the spirits of a lot of the protesters who were part of the whole campaign, because when they protested and demanded that the president resign, they were also asking that the prime minister, the current president Ranil Wickremesinghe, to resign. What we saw happen in the parliamentary vote that followed, and according to the constitution, the parliament was to elect an interim president until the term is over. And the results of it was something that was very disappointing. It's definitely not what the whole campaign, the loads of people who came out onto the streets and protested, demanded for. And so it's again another moment that we have to reckon with in Sri Lanka, and how things would evolve from now on is something that we would continue to watch out.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stop you. Please continue.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that the current president has also, presided as prime minister several times in the country. He could not win a seat in parliament in the last general elections. And so he was squarely rejected by the people. And as I mentioned to you, the protesters have continuously demanded for his resignation. They still are demanding for his resignation. And even the political party that he belonged to, what is known as the Grand Old Party, the United National Party, split because he was holding on to power for so long, and they felt like they needed change, and that's how the current opposition, the SJP, was formed. However, he seems to be a favorite among international actors and maybe sections of the middle class in Sri Lanka. He is known to support neoliberal reforms in the country, and perhaps that's one reason that some people hope that he could help take forward the IMF reforms, but the general sense is that he is not going to be capable to bring the country out of the kind of very deep economic collapse that it's facing right now. It's not something that can be solved overnight, and we are all aware of it. But what also needs to happen is to ensure that people's suffering is alleviated in some way. There has to be a stimulus program, there has to be relief that's distributed to the people. We have to think of a redistributive agenda. However, what is currently on the table is an austerity program. Which again is not going to address people's suffering. And therefore, we are expecting that turmoil and protests will continue in the country as long as the current president remains in power.
I think that the images that were coming out of Sri Lanka a couple weeks ago of the storming of the sort of president's residence and the swimming in the swimming pool and all these kinds of things probably had capitalist or elites around the world quite frightened about what can happen when you deny people access to the basic things they need to survive. But one of the ways it's been portrayed in the American media or Western media in general has been to say that Sri Lanka is experiencing this crisis because they're in debt to China. They're in like this debt trap with China, which I thought was a little bit funny because I think that something like 80% of Sri Lanka's debt is actually with Western financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. That said, can you give us some background on what precipitated this economic collapse? I know there was, we saw in the news weeks ahead of this, recent uprising, if you will, that there was horrible fuel shortages, perhaps for the past few months. Food prices had skyrocketed. There's been food shortages. So was this because a result of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia? Does it go further back than that? What caused this crisis?
Well, for the people on the ground, it is the long queues for fuels. Some people are just sleeping overnight for days, just waiting to get a few liters of fuel. And there is food shortages. The country has run out of foreign reserves to import essential items, including things like milk powder, which a lot of people in Sri Lanka depend on. And there's a shortage of medicines. The hospitals have been facing these shortages and having to prioritize surgeries and so on. And food prices have just skyrocketed. So in the last month, food inflation alone has reached about 80%. A large portion of the population have either reduced the number of meals that they eat or the quantities that they eat. So this is a massive, crisis, and it's affecting everyone across the island. Although, of course, some are affected more than others. There are daily wage workers, people working in plantations, in the agricultural sector. Women are mostly impacted by this, and other minority groups and groups who have been marginalized for their identities, again, really find it difficult to access basic things in the midst of this crisis. The root causes of the crisis, of course, Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt obligations earlier this year. As you correctly pointed out, the big chunk of foreign debt is held in international sovereign bond loans, which means big financial companies, private companies, and investment banks. Many of them in the West, in the West. China's debt is only about 10% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt, and we've seen that since the end of the war in Sri Lanka in 2009, the governments that were in power focused a lot on investing in large-scale infrastructure, like big ports, airports, and so on, and not really on creating jobs for the people. And I think this kind of economic policies goes all the way back to the 1970s when Sri Lanka moved into trade liberalization. There was a structural adjustment program which was implemented by the International Monetary Fund, and the economic policy making since then has geared towards privatization, to cuts in public spending, as well as trade liberalization. So right now there's a huge trade deficit in the country. We are importing much more than we can export. Um, and it has also created a change in the economic structure. One of the major reasons, as I mentioned before, is the lack of foreign reserves in the country. However, foreign reserves are earned by mostly women's labor in three sectors. In the free trade zones, in export processing zones, in garment factories, and then in the plantation sector, exporting tea, and by domestic labor in people who go abroad to Middle Eastern countries and so on. So it's largely an economy dependent on women's labor. But we're also finding now is that the whole burden of bearing the brunt of the crisis also falls on women. So it's something for us to think about, because it's not just about loans that have been generated by China or other countries. It's also about private investments in sovereign bonds and so on, as well as the long kind of trajectory of economic policy making in the country that has eventually brought us to this current crisis. Another major, I think, factor that we are grappling with right now is the food crisis. The government implemented an erratic fertilizer policy last year in the pretext of introducing organic fertilizers. However, trying to do it overnight without any consultation with farmers or experts. The result was that there is a reduction in local food production as well. And as you know, as many other countries in the world are already impacted by the Ukraine war, the rise in commodity prices globally, and in a moment like this, when our local food system is also in a crisis, is something that's worrying. We are expecting a famine-like situation to emerge soon in the country, and that ideally should be the priority of any government that comes into power. However, right now we are dealing with a political crisis and a battle for power, which doesn't seem to be too cognizant of what people have to go through in a complete economic collapse.
Well, I want to also ask you this as well: as what could a different sort of economic direction look like? Because I think that's also a question. Is it almost in the Western media, especially, is being presented as sort of a fait accompli, that the only solution is the IMF or to borrow from India or whoever it may be, and that there's nothing else that can be done but to continue this course, the state of affairs. So what would it look like, in your view and those you work with, to have a sort of a different path that would address some of the people's needs that have gone so unmet so far?
I think the question is also whether what's happening in Sri Lanka is just something within its national borders, or is it something are we seeing kind of, is Sri Lanka like a precursor to what might happen globally? What is happening with debt and sustainability of debt in many of the developing countries, right? Particularly after COVID, and then the impact COVID had as well, and then now the Ukraine war. Sri Lanka has very often been a forerunner in many things. It was the first country in Asia to introduce universal suffrage. So in democracy, we were one of the leaders. It was the first country in South Asia to go into a trade liberalization and a neoliberal kind of economic policy regime. We also saw Sri Lanka as being used as an experiment ground in 2002 with internationalized peace process and a neoliberal agenda being put forward, which ended up in a massive failure, and it made way for a, an authoritarian and singular Buddhist nationalist government to come into power. Um, and so the question is, whether what's going on in Sri Lanka is something that we might see globally, and if so, is austerity the way that can also address the crisis, or should we be looking much more in terms of alternatives? Sri Lanka has already been through 16 IMF agreements. The last IMF agreement was implemented under the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe. And we have been through this whole program of implementing austerity policies, and we're still back, in a much deeper crisis. And so the question of alternatives must be central to the discussions right now. What we believe in Sri Lanka is that in a moment of crisis, the government has to implement a program, a stimulus program, to invest in the economy, not cut down on public spending. And as I mentioned before, the food crisis is going to be crucial, and it's going to aggravate, I think, in the next few months. And something, groups like the group I belong to, the Feminist Collective for Economic Justice, have put forward a demand for a food distribution system with controlled prices to be implemented as soon as possible. And for so long, agriculture and the rural sector have been neglected. And urbanization programs have been prioritized in its place, and as I mentioned, large-scale infrastructure. And I think now it's a moment to kind of rethink about food sovereignty, of ensuring food systems are not messed with, but also invested and strengthened at this time. And so I feel like those are kind of moments that policies that we can kind of think of immediately in the short term and make way for. And of course, the question of redistribution. Currently, foreign exchange and foreign earnings have plummeted for various reasons, but there's always wealth as a stock that's lying around. And something that we have also been putting forward is to implement a wealth tax as a redistribution tool to help the country kind of survive this crisis. In terms of the political layout, it doesn't seem a good move to push for IMF negotiations at the moment when there's so much political instability. And we are hoping that elections could be called for at a reasonable time, because the government has lost its mandate completely. And so until the time a new government is brought into power, maybe stalling negotiations would be a good way forward.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side and, helping us sort through all of this. Niyanthini Kadirgamar, thank you so much for joining us here and giving us some time on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.